Moving on to the financial update. At this point, we will have Mrs. Christine Torres of Crowe Horvath, accounting firm, and Mr. Langer will complete the financial update later in the meeting under informational items. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for having me here tonight. I'm here tonight to present the board with the results of the agreed upon procedures that was completed on site earlier in 2015. First thing I would like to go over briefly is just what an agreed upon procedures is and explain that it's not an audit. It doesn't take into account all aspects of your finances and books. What it does is it does outline certain procedures that have been requested to be done and completes those procedures as they're stated. All of the information from what says in those procedures is then reported. There is no materiality concept in an AUP. The procedure is done and the results are reported. So with that, I'm going to go through each procedure and then give a brief summary of what the report states. And then after that, or if you have any questions as I go along, please feel free to let me know. So our first procedure is to compare and agree the bond proceeds and investment earnings from the bond issues in 2006, 2007, and 2009, as noted in the sources and uses information in the bond documents to what was recorded in the district's bank accounts and accounted for in the general ledger. The result of that step showed that all bond proceeds and investment earnings issued for the non-refunding purposes and for refunding purposes were deposited into the district's bank account and accounted for correctly in the district's funds. The sources and uses documents were obtained and compared to the bank statements, and there was no discrepancies found during that process. In addition, all of the proceeds and investment earnings were accounted for within the financial statements. Our second step then goes on to say that we are to determine by inspecting invoices, journal entries, bank statements of the bond proceeds and earnings for the same bond issues, if they were spent on expenditures as described in the ballot proposition of the 2006 referendum. Now this step is quite a bit more complicated than that first step because there are multiple different types of documents that we are looking at here. You have not just the bank statements and the sources and uses. You also have journal entries, you have transfers, you have invoices. What we found when we completed this step was that all bond proceeds and earnings were spent for school purposes. However, some expenditures that were less than the amount of the interest income earned was spent on supplies that cannot be expensed to the capital projects fund. Instead, these supplies should have been expensed to the education fund. All of the expenditures of the bond were documented in the general ledger through invoices, electronic fund payments, journal entries, or transfers to other funds. In the report itself, you will see a listing of those invoices that we found were spent on supplies and not on capital purposes. It will describe the date, the amount, the school, and a short, brief explanation of what it was spent on. In most cases, it includes music supplies, athletic supplies, library supplies, or some miscellaneous items. The total of this is $366,985.75. In addition, as we went through this, we identified following transfers of interest income. There were 5 of them that were identified as being made. 2 were board approved, and we noted that in the minutes and noted the date that occurred. However, the remaining 3 we identified as never being presented to the board and thus were not approved. That approval is required by the State Board of Ed, and in our Procedure 3, that was one of the items that had been identified, that we were to identify anything that did not follow State of Illinois ISB proceedings. In addition, we identified a number of journal entries that did not have the proper supporting invoices. These items represented a reclassification of expenses that were school expenses that were recorded on other funds and then transferred to the capital project fund. Those reclassifications has also been outlined within the report. One thing that we also identified as we moved to step 3, where we had to identify and agree the presentation of the bond proceeds, the investment earnings, and related expenditures and transfers to what is outlined in the general ledger and to the requirements of the Illinois Program Accounting Manual. In addition to the transfers that were not board approved, we identified that the 2009 bond proceeds were not actually deposited within a capital projects fund. They were deposited into a life safety fund. Due to the type of bond that it was, it should have been kept into the capital projects fund. Also, the capital projects fund was closed at the end of fiscal year 2011 without board approval. This did happen through one of the transfers that was not presented to the board for approval. Finally, the other item that we identified throughout this review that does not follow the above stated guidance was temporary loans that was through the use of the bond funds to cover expenditures in the general bank account, the payroll bank account, and the student activity bank account. All of the funds that were transferred to these bank accounts were then transferred back to the capital projects fund. Within the report, there is a table that outlines all of these transfers that occurred from the site and construction fund bank account to these other bank accounts, and the dates that that money was then transferred back to the site and construction fund bank account. Finally, we have one additional table that identifies transfers that did occur from these other bank accounts to the site and construction fund bank account and then back. So there were transfers going both directions, out of the bank account to other funds and from other funds to the site and construction fund. This would happen when it appeared that within the site and construction fund, the investments, for some reason or another, could not be cashed out in time to pay the bills for the site and construction fund. So these again were temporary loans that happened from these other accounts to site and construction and then were paid back. So all of this has been explained and included within the report. Are there any questions that I could take or answer that anyone has regarding this report from the board?
Any board members have any questions at this time?
So for the second test where you're inspecting the
Speak up.
For the second test where you're inspecting the invoices, it says all bond proceeds and earnings were spent for school purposes. However, some expenditures that were less than the amount of the interest income earned. What's the reasoning for that statement being in there, that they're less than the amount of the interest income earned?
According to the way bond proceeds and bond documents read, interest income does not always, on bond money does not always have to be spent on capital projects. That the state of Illinois and bonds do allow for that interest income to be transferred out to other funds for their use in those funds. It should require board approval and go through the proper procedures. However, that is something that is allowed to happen for those amounts of interest income.
And then the list of items under finding number 2, the reason that those specific line items were found is because they were made from the capital projects fund?
Correct. It's because they were charged to the capital projects fund and paid from bond proceeds, where the bond was set up for capital items and to equip the schools. However, that did not apply to regular supplies. So those supplies should not have been charged to the capital projects fund. They should have been charged to the education fund and paid out of general money.
I realize an agreed procedure report that you've done that it's specific to what we're looking for, asking you to look for. If you notice something outside of the scope of that, would you address that, or how do you deal with that?
We would not address it within this report, as we can only report specifically what is in the procedure. However, if as we're going through we identified something that looks odd or did not look right, we would bring it up to management that we were working with during the performance of the procedures, yes.
And did any of that happen during this audit?
The only item that we had brought up that we thought looked unusual was when journal entries were being recorded, there did not always appear to be a certain approval process that was standard or certain documentation that was always required with those journal entries. So that would be something that we say would need some additional documentation or review over that, whatever process is now in place.
Thank you.
One question is, just so I make sure I understand this, under the agreed procedures that this was done,
Yes.
if, as you were running through all those bond proceeds and that, and all those large dollars, if you saw something, is that open to any interpretation on your part, or are you required just to report it as it is?
We're required to just report it as it is.
Good.
There's
Thank
no,
It's good that it's reported as it is, yes.
yeah, it's reported as it is. It is what it is.
There's no interpretation.
There's no interpretation.
So we talk about the transfers, basically what was going on was a great shell game.
Yes, it was basically just moving from account to account.
And you mentioned there was money transferred that required board approval, and it was never brought to our attention.
Correct. It was, yes, there was movement going on there.
Where'd the money go? Where's it transferred to? Where?
I think, can I just please confirm, that this does show that there was money that was spent inappropriately from funds that shouldn't have been there. There was money. Again, without board approval, there's no record of it ever being approved. It was done internally by former administration, from my understanding.
Correct. It does show.
Current too.
Excuse me, I'll remind the crowd to please.
Correct. It does show that there was money spent inappropriately. It shows that transfers were made without presentation to the board and without board approval, and that transfers between bank accounts occurred that should not have occurred.
All right, one other clarification. Some of this money was interest that was earned on the bonds, and it would have been acceptable to put it into those accounts and spend it the way it was spent if the board had approved.
Correct,
But
yes.
the board never was given that approval.
Correct. Yes, that is correct.
Thank you.
Any other questions? At this time, we're going to deviate from the agenda, and I'm going to request a motion to go into closed session to discuss the appointment, employment, compensation, discipline, performance, or dismissal of employees, collective negotiating, meetings between internal or external auditors, audit committees, finance committees, and their equivalents. May I have a motion, please?
So moved.
Second? Second. Roll call, please.
Mr. Luo?
Aye.
Mr. Lucetti?
Aye.
Mr. Kozel?
Aye.
Dr. Casey? Aye. Mrs. Glatz?
Aye.
Mrs. Molinari?
Aye.